Part 1, The Lens of Truth. Ed had always seen the world through a lens. It was more than just his job, it was how he understood everything. The colors of the city streets, the shadows that hid secrets in plain sight, the quiet despair in people's eyes when they thought no one was looking. He could capture it all with a click, freeze it in time, and show the world what it was too afraid to see. His studio was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. The walls were lined with photographs, faces, moments, places, all taken from a distance. There was something about being an observer, an outsider, that gave him power. It was like he was on the edge of things, watching without ever truly touching. But lately, something was different. He could feel it in his bones. The photos on his wall didn't look the same anymore. They were shifting, flickering in the corner of his vision, as if they were alive. At first, he thought it was just fatigue. The late nights, the constant editing. But when he checked his prints in the morning, they were wrong. Details were missing, faces distorted, shadows where none should have been. One evening, as Ed worked late into the night, the hum of the darkroom lights his only companion, he noticed something strange in the frame of a new photo he had taken. It was of an old building, decaying but proud. The kind of place he usually avoided. It felt haunted, or maybe it was just the peeling paint and broken windows that made it feel wrong. He zoomed in on the image, adjusting the contrast. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure he didn't remember seeing when he'd taken the shot. A woman. Her face was pale, featureless, like someone erased her identity with a brushstroke. But the worst part? She was looking straight at him. He flinched and pulled back from the screen, his heart racing. His fingers trembled as he reached for the camera, checking the shot he had taken. No sign of the woman. She wasn't there. The photo was wrong. No. It couldn't be. Ed had a sharp eye, a professional's touch. He had never made a mistake like this before. It wasn't possible. But when he turned back to the photo, the woman's eyes seemed to follow him. And that was just the beginning. Part 2, The Focus of Madness. For the next few days, Ed couldn't shake the image of the woman. Every time he closed his eyes, her pale, featureless face haunted him. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, a product of overwork, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He spent hours in his darkroom, enlarging the photograph, scrutinizing every pixel, looking for any hint of an explanation. But the woman remained, there, in the doorway, staring at him. Sometimes her eyes seemed darker, other times they gleamed with an eerie light, but always, they followed his every movement. He tried to ignore it. He had a reputation to maintain, after all. He was Ed Turner, photographer to the stars, the guy who could capture beauty and soul with just one click. But every time he looked at the photo, a cold chill crawled up his spine. Something wasn't right. The image was haunting him, pulling him in. His obsession grew. He couldn't focus on anything else. Work began to pile up, clients complaining, deadlines missed. His once pristine studio was now littered with half-finished projects and cluttered equipment. But none of it mattered. He had to know. He had to uncover who that woman was, and why she was in his photo. The next evening, with the photo still in front of him, Ed decided he would visit the building where he had taken the shot. He had to see it for himself. Maybe there was something about the place that made the photograph distort in such a strange way. Maybe it had some dark history, some supernatural connection that was leaking into his work. It wasn't far, just a few blocks down. Ed grabbed his camera and headed out into the night, the cold air biting at his face as he walked. The city had an odd stillness to it at this hour. The streets were empty, and the only sounds were his footsteps echoing off the pavement and the distant hum of neon lights flickering above him. When he arrived at the building, it looked even worse than he remembered. The front door hung ajar, and the windows were boarded up, covered with layers of peeling paint and grime. There was no sign of life, no indication that anyone had been here in years. But as Ed stepped closer, he felt a shift in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It wasn't just the building that felt wrong, it was something in the atmosphere, something thick and suffocating. He had felt it when he took the photo, too, but now it was more pronounced, almost as if the building itself were breathing, watching him. He stood there for a moment, debating whether to go in. Then, without warning, the door creaked open slightly. It wasn't the wind, he was sure of that. Someone, or something, was inside. Ed's heart raced. He wasn't sure if he was being foolish or brave, but either way, he stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick with dust, stale and heavy. The room he entered was dark, only a sliver of moonlight slipping through the boarded-up windows to illuminate the space. The floor creaked under his weight as he moved deeper into the building, his camera raised, ready to capture anything strange he might encounter. He felt the pull of something in the back of his mind, urging him forward. And then, as he passed a doorway at the end of a long hallway, he saw it. A room. Or perhaps it was more of a chamber, large, empty, save for one thing in the center. A large, full-length mirror. It stood there, unblemished and shining, as if it had been placed there intentionally, waiting. Its edges were decorated with strange carvings that Ed couldn't quite make out, like something ancient and forgotten. The mirror seemed out of place, almost too pristine for a building like this. Ed couldn't resist. He stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord, as if the mirror were calling to him. He raised the camera, ready to capture it. But just before he pressed the shutter, something strange happened. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. It was him. But not just him, behind him stood the woman from the photograph. Her pale face was now clearer, more defined, her features sharp and horrifyingly empty. She was standing just a few feet behind him, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Ed froze. The camera slipped from his fingers, crashing to the ground. The woman's gaze never left him, her stare deepening into his soul, as if she were trying to pull him in, drag him into the mirror with her. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air was thick with silence. Then, suddenly, the woman's form flickered, just a flash, but it was enough to break Ed from his trance. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, his breath quick and shallow. The mirror in front of him warped, distorting as the woman's face stretched, elongated, and then it shattered. Shards of glass flew across the room, slicing through the air, some of them grazing Ed's skin. He covered his face and fell to the floor, the echo of the shattering glass ringing in his ears. When he finally looked up, the room was empty again. No woman. No mirror, just the shattered glass scattered across the floor. His mind raced. He couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Was he losing his grip on reality? Had the building somehow gotten inside his head, twisting his perception of time and space? He had to get out of there. But as he turned to leave, his camera caught his eye. It had fallen near the doorway, its lens cracked but still functional. He picked it up, shaking, and examined the last photo taken before the mirror shattered. The image was still there. The woman's face was clearer than ever, and this time, there was no mistaking it. She was no longer behind him. She was inside the frame. Staring directly at him. Part 3, Through the Frame. Ed couldn't sleep. He didn't remember the last time he'd felt rested, maybe before all of this had started, before the strange woman had appeared in his photographs, before the mirror shattered. He'd locked himself inside his studio, pacing in the small, dimly lit space. The walls around him seemed to close in, but it wasn't the room. No, it was the photos. He had started printing more images, taking more shots in different locations, each frame, each click, hoping that the next one would bring him closer to understanding what was happening. But they all had one thing in common. The woman. She was in every single one. Some images were blurry, others distorted. In one, her face was barely a silhouette, just a faint shadow in the corner of a room. In another, she was at the edge of a street, barely visible through the fog. But the last one, the one taken right after he'd left the abandoned building, showed her clearly, her ghostly face more defined, her eyes hollow and staring. She wasn't just appearing in his photos. She was inside them. As if the lens were some kind of doorway, pulling her into his world. Ed tried to reason with himself. It was a psychological trick, right? He was losing his mind from stress, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of his work. But the more he looked at the photos, the more the doubt gnawed at him. This wasn't just a product of his imagination. This was something real. He had to understand it. He needed to confront it. So, he did what he thought was the only logical thing left to do, he returned to the building. The same one where the mirror had shattered, the same one where he had seen her face. He wasn't sure what he expected to find this time. Maybe he was hoping for a logical explanation, something that could prove to him that he wasn't crazy. But deep down, he knew, he wasn't going to find answers. Still, he had to try. The building was even more decrepit than it had been before. The walls were crumbling, the smell of mildew thick in the air. Ed felt a sense of déjà vu as he pushed open the door, which creaked in protest. The darkness inside seemed to pull at him, like a heavy weight on his chest. But he couldn't turn back. He had come too far. This time, though, the building was different. There were no flickering lights, no distant whispers, no haunting shadows in the corner of his eye. It was silent, unnervingly silent. As Ed walked through the hallways, the feeling of being watched returned, but this time it was even more suffocating. His heart raced in his chest, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. It wasn't just the building. It was something else. Something more. Finally, he found the room, the one with the mirror. The door was ajar. Ed hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered it, but the mirror was gone. Instead, there was a frame, its edges rusted and cracked. The glass was shattered, scattered across the floor like jagged teeth. He knelt to get a closer look, carefully avoiding the shards. And then he saw it. On the back wall, etched into the peeling paint, was a message. It was written in some sort of fluid, dark substance that Ed couldn't identify. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if they had been scratched into the wall in a frantic, desperate hand. You can never leave. She's coming for you. Ed's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. Was this a warning? Had the building known? Had she known? His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned and ran out of the room, not daring to look back. He needed to get out. He needed to leave before whatever was happening swallowed him whole. Back at his studio, Ed's hands shook as he flipped through the photos once more. They were all distorted now. Faces blurred. Buildings warped. But there was one photograph that stood out, one he hadn't noticed before. It was a shot from a different angle, taken just as he had left the building. And in the foreground, on the sidewalk, stood the woman. This time, though, she wasn't in the doorway. She wasn't standing in the shadows. She was looking directly at the camera. At him. But this time, her face was clearer. And in her hollow eyes, Ed saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. She knew him. She had been waiting for him. Days passed. Ed barely left the studio. He couldn't risk it. The woman, the photos, they were driving him to the edge. But there was one thing he needed to do before it was too late. He needed to destroy the camera. The one that had captured her face. The one that had opened the doorway, but when he reached for the camera, it felt different. It wasn't like his other equipment. It had become heavier, as though it had absorbed something. A dark energy. The lens cracked. A flash shot a bright, white light. And in that light, Ed saw her. She was standing in front of him now, fully formed, her face twisted into an expression of grief and rage. Her eyes burned with a fury that was almost too much to bear. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Ed could feel his heart stop. He tried to step back, but the room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him. She was no longer a photograph. She was here. He looked down at the shattered pieces of his camera on the floor, the fragments of his last attempt to break free from her grasp. But it was too late. Part 4, The Lens of No Return. The days blurred together after the camera shattered. Ed wasn't sure what time it was anymore, whether it was morning or night, whether the world outside his studio even existed. All he could see was her. The woman. She was everywhere. In every photo. In every reflection. In every shadow. The walls of his studio felt thinner, as if they were closing in around him. The windows seemed to stretch, distorting the view outside until the streets looked like melted paint. The familiar sound of passing cars became muffled, like whispers in the distance. But the worst part was the feeling that the woman was always there, lurking in the corners of his vision, just beyond his reach. She wasn't just in his photographs anymore. She was in the air, in the walls, in his thoughts. And now, she was in his mind. Ed could hear her voice. Soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. She would say his name in that same haunting tone, stretching the syllables like an eerie lullaby. But when he listened closer, the words weren't comforting. They were commanding. You cannot escape me. It was like a pulse in his brain, repeating, echoing, until there was no room for anything else. The photos had become worse. They weren't just distorted, they were alive. Faces screened from the frames, buildings twisted into grotesque shapes, and in every single one, the woman's figure grew stronger, clearer, more real. But then one night, something happened that made his blood run cold. It was the last straw, the thing that broke him completely. He was working late, trying to burn through his last batch of photos, when his computer screen flickered. The image on it, another one of the photos of the building, suddenly rippled. The woman was no longer in the frame. She was stepping out of it. He sat frozen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to move. The image on the screen started to bend and twist like it was being pulled into some unseen force. The woman's figure crawled out of the photo, her limbs stretching unnaturally as her face twisted with malice. Her mouth opened, a gaping abyss of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light around it. And then, with a final scream, she lunged. Ed screamed, but it wasn't his voice. It wasn't his body. His mind, his very consciousness, felt ripped apart. His vision swam with color and blackness, flashes of light and shadow fighting for dominance. The screen flickered again, but now it was as if the woman had entered him. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his hands trembling uncontrollably. But she was still there, still inside, her presence suffocating him, clawing at the edges of his sanity. The studio around him seemed to shift. The walls began to melt, the photos bleeding together like wet ink, and Ed felt his body disintegrate into the madness. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The boundaries between the world and the photos had ceased to exist. And then, in the center of the room, the woman appeared, not through the photos anymore, but standing right there, in the flesh. She was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a hungry smile. You never learned, Ed. You thought you could control me, but you were just a lens. A tool. A means to an end. Her voice was everywhere, filling his ears, his mind, his very soul. It wasn't her words that terrorized him, though, it was the fact that he could feel them, like cold fingers crawling beneath his skin. The woman raised her hand. Ed's vision spun, and in a moment of horror, he saw something he had missed before, the mirror. It stood behind her, in the center of the room, but it wasn't the shattered, broken mirror from the abandoned building. It was whole again. Polished. Perfect. And in it, Ed saw his reflection. But it wasn't him. It was her. He was the one who was shattered. He gasped, reaching out toward the mirror, but his hand only met glass that felt cold as death. He backed away, unable to look away from the reflection. The woman in the mirror was smiling now, smiling at him. "I am you now, Ed. You belong to me." Suddenly, a voice, his own voice, but distant, called out from somewhere within his own mind. "No. I. But it was too late. He was already becoming her. The woman's power over him was too strong, too all-encompassing. Her presence in his mind suffocated him, pulling him deeper into her reality. The world around him spun faster. The photos around the room swirled like they were caught in a tornado, all of them flashing with horrific images of faces and places that didn't belong. Ed couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then, with one final, crushing pressure, the studio around him, his life, his memories, collapsed. Epilogue, through the shattered frame. The next morning, the sun rose like any other day, but Ed was no longer in his studio. In his place stood the photographs. They had absorbed him, his soul, his essence, everything he was, into the frames. The images of his final moments remained, each photo capturing his descent into madness. The woman, her pale face twisted with joy, was in every one of them. Ed Turner, photographer to the stars, was no more. But the woman? She was still there. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, her next victim would be captured in the lens, their souls slowly siphoned away, piece by piece. The end.